Hello. I am going to go over political parties and the main platforms. I don't discuss the Tea Party as I go through this, but we might incorporate some of that as we go. I'm going to look at the basics as far as liberals, conservatives, or libertarians, and kind of go through some of the key issues that we run across and how they feel about those issues. Is a good idea to know the platforms and sort of where they all fall, because that influences how you look at an issue. All right, so the top part there, all you see is the basics as far as where they fall. Libertarians are going to value freedom first and foremost over everything. Liberals do value freedom, but they tend to focus more on equality, so they'll sacrifice some freedom for equality. Conservatives will restrict freedom in some areas for social order, but do value freedom in other areas, similar to libertarians when it comes to the market and stuff like that. All right, the first issue on there is Social Security. Obviously, the Republican Party would like to privatize it, kind of let Edward Jones and company have control of it, let you have more access and power over your own Social Security, and probably do away with the government-sponsored Social Security. Progressives want to keep that safety net in place, so they would be in favor of keeping the Social Security we have. They would want to scrap the cap so that there isn't a cap anymore on it, that the wealthy pay in a certain percentage just as the rest of us pay in a percentage. And libertarians would be more free market, so at least have an opt-out, if not just not have it as well, or privatize it. And there are some benefits to privatizing it, obviously. You'd have more control over it. You'd be able to give it to your family more easily and stuff like that. On the other side, a lot of people can't afford to do that, so the safety net option that the progressives favor is nice for them, because you can always set up your own, retirement and stuff, but you would have that safety net in place where the government would sponsor something for you for retirement, mainly as a supplement for most middle-class families still. Obviously, the big difference would be in the jobs and economy area. For the conservatives, you're looking at more of what they would call essentially being pro-corporate, pro-big business, more tax breaks for the rich, and so forth, and in hopes, of course, that it's all going to trickle down to the middle and lower classes. The philosophy is the more money you give to corporations, the more power you give to the wealthy, the more of that money will certainly be there for the working class. So if you make them wealthy, they're going to make sure the jobs stay here, the jobs are paying well, everybody has access to good health care, so forth and so on. The progressives are going to say, no, that's probably not what's going to happen. What we'll see happening is more wealth and income inequality. The jobs will still be outsourced, so forth and so on. So they would say 70% of the economy is based on consumer spending. Give tax breaks to the middle, give more benefits to the middle, make sure that wages are good for middle-class citizens. The more money they have, they're going to spend, and that's going to help the economy. Libertarians believe in free market, so the Republicans and Libertarians would be pretty much on the same page there. And that goes into the economy, trickle-down economics, and so forth there as well. So on the one hand, the libertarians and the conservatives would say, let the market decide what everybody is paid, essentially get rid of the things like minimum wage and so forth, and make sure that there are benefits there for the wealthy. If you make it more affordable for the wealthy, they're going to make sure everybody's taken care of. The progressives are going to say, focus on the working class and middle class, make sure that you have strong unions in place, make sure that you have a decent living wage established, and if you give more people more money, they're going to spend it in the economy, and therefore that's going to help the economy keep going. And they would say that if you give rich people more, essentially they can only buy so many cars, they can only buy so many pants, they can only buy so many this, that, or the other thing. Whereas if you give millions of people more, they're going to actually buy more things and spend their money, where most of the people that are wealthy are just going to invest and so forth and not necessarily put it back into the economy. But they definitely differ on the outlook on jobs and economy, the one being more middle class focused from the progressive side, and the other being more focused on the corporations themselves and give them the tax breaks, and that's going to help everybody else out. When it comes to the military, well, quite honestly, they all like spending. So let's start there. I guess I think 59 cents on every federal dollar goes to tanks, bombs, and nukes and so forth. And so we obviously spend much on the military. But that aside, I guess traditionally you would say the conservatives are thought of as more being the war hawks, and the liberals, kind of more the hippies, and let's be diplomatic and let's not bomb as much. But as far as feeding the military-industrial complex goes, it's been going on for a while. Whether you have a Republican or a Democratic president, is still happening. So we spend a lot on the military, but traditionally speaking, conservatives are a little more war hawkish, if you will, and liberals a little more diplomatic, if you will. Tort reform, you can kind of see there. That just has to do with how much you can sue. Should you put a cap on being able to sue? I would say that the conservatives will come up with some of those ideas where, if you keep on letting them sue too much, then it's going to, make rates go too high, and all that's going to be pushed back on the consumer. Whereas the progressives are going to say, you can't put a number on my daughter's dead. So if she's dead, I should be able to sue for millions if I want. If you put a cap of like 10,000 on it, how are you going to say that her life was only worth 10,000? So they would say you have to look at each individual case, and you can't put caps on any of it. Tax reform we've already looked at, obviously. The conservatives like to give them more tax breaks to the wealthy. We just saw that $1.5 trillion tax cut for the wealthy. Almost all of it, 83% of it, goes straight to the top 1%. But the thought is that they'll take care of everybody else if you take care of them. Whereas on the other side, the progressives are going to say, we actually need to close all the loopholes. We make it so that they're actually paying the same types of taxes that middle-class families are paying and so forth. And if anything, tax breaks should go to the middle class, not to the wealthy. So that they would kind of say have more of the progressive tax scale in place. Immigration, well, I thought most were kind of coming together on this. And then, President Trump was elected, and we've seen things I never thought I'd see, like baby jails and so forth, take place. Certainly the wall has been an issue always, but the wall isn't a very conservative idea. I mean, that would be very expensive, and obviously it's not going to actually keep all the immigrants out. Many of the immigrants, fly here, and the wall's not going to stop that. They just oversee their visas. So definitely, there's a different approach towards immigration, and the progressives are, more open to amnesty. They're more open to giving a path to citizenship. They look at the situations where, okay, some of these people were brought here when they were 2 months old. They've been an American their whole life. They have jobs. They're paying taxes. They should have some path to keeping them here, not just instantaneously deporting them. But the more conservative stand is, there's a law. They broke the law. We need to deport them and shuffle it out later. So that's how the other side sees it. With faith and so forth, obviously, the evangelicals are a strong portion of the Republican base, and so you're going to see a lot of pro-Christian ideas. And probably the main difference, I think, is progressives pretty strongly say separation of church and state. We have too many religions and belief systems. You could be anything from Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, atheist, agnostic, whatever, Scientologist if you want, but we can't make laws based on any religious doctrine. It's important to keep that separate from the laws that we create. Everyone has the right, certainly, to practice a religion, but you don't make laws based upon one belief system or another. So they would definitely be strong in the idea of separation of church and state, whereas some of the conservatives might let some Christian doctrine step in. Now they might, say this is, a religious freedom and so forth. So I don't want to sell a cake to a homosexual and all that kind of stuff. But others on the other side would say that shouldn't be an issue. So they're not going to agree on these things. The other part of it, of course, is the creationism versus evolution and what we teach in school, and allowing prayer in school. But prayer is allowed in school. It's just as a teacher, I can't say, okay, everybody fold your hands and pray. But each individual has the right to practice his or her religion, whether that be Buddhism, Christianity, or whatnot. But they definitely differ on I guess the main thing is the separation of church and state. Of course, with education too is going to come vouchers and how much we fund, and austerity is a part of the conservative philosophy. Public schools are a tax burden, so certainly paying them less, paying teachers less, giving less money, breaking up teacher unions, all that kind of stuff is stuff you've seen on the right. We definitely have seen it here in Iowa. They've gone through, once they had power, and neutered the union to the best of their ability, so that all that you can negotiate at all right now is just basic wage, not coaching, not extra duty, certainly not how much you pay towards health insurance or anything like that. And they also like voucher programs and ways of getting public funds into the private enterprise, essentially private schools, whereas progressives tend to be much more pro giving money to public schools, pro union, and they don't want to see the voucher programs because public schools need all the money they have. We don't want to see that money being placed elsewhere because they need that money. So they definitely have a different outlook on education and education funding. Obviously, abortion is a big issue. Conservatives would say at the moment of conception, the child is a separate entity and has his own constitutional rights at that moment, and so we shouldn't have abortion. Progressives would say that it's a part of the woman's body and it's a part of her choice up to a certain point when it could survive, the embryo could survive outside of the womb, and then we consider it a separate entity. Libertarians, of course, would be pro-choice. Libel laws and so forth just has to do with should we have, essentially more regulations on the way our food is made, processed, all that kind of stuff. Is it worth it to try to keep E. coli and other stuff out, to pay a little bit more to make sure that they're getting into the factories and making sure they're clean and all that kind of stuff? Should we have cameras there? And the one side would probably, try to protect the corporations a little more. The other side would, the progressives would say, hey, I'll pay 10, 20 cents more for my hamburger if I know I have more of a chance of it being safe. Healthcare, obviously the conservatives want to keep the private healthcare system in place and kind of have the market decide what the rates are going to be. And the progressives want to join the rest of the developed democracies and have some sort of a universal coverage, whatever that might end up looking like. But it really comes down to, is healthcare a privilege for those that have a good enough job and so forth to afford it, or is it a right that people should have because of, essentially, if you don't have access to it, you could die. So they differ on that, certainly. And of course, the whole how do you pay for it, cut some military spending, progressive tax scale. You're not going to have a health premium anymore, so there's that. And getting your employer out of it could be nice for some of the employees, so there is that as well. But healthcare is obviously a large issue, and the premiums are getting to the point where many middle-class families can't afford them, so it's certainly something to consider. Foreign policy, we talked about a little bit already, pro-UN, pro-diplomatic versus more maybe nationalist and so forth. The environment, conservatives are going to be a little more likely to drill, have pipelines, things that are profitable for corporations are going to be seen as a good thing. They're not going to be as concerned with climate change and stuff like that. Some of them might, bring up references to weather and say it's climate change. And the progressives are going to be very concerned about climate change because it's very threatening to our existence. And they're going to also be concerned about the environment, feel we have a obligation to take care of the environment, to think of the generations that are coming after us. And even though it might make more money and it might be better for the economy to do certain things, we don't necessarily just go ahead and do them without thinking through what might the consequences be. So essentially, they differ on the approach to the environment in many of those situations. Guns, I think the NRA and the Republican Party are pretty tied together and want as little gun control as possible. Certainly the progressives are more likely to say, let's have background checks, let's slow down the access to guns, let's question whether we need certain guns to hunt, so forth and so on. Gay rights, especially the more religious conservative on the right, would oppose that. Pence certainly has put up his ideas about gay marriage, and he actually still believes in conversion therapy and other such things, whereas the progressives are going to say, hey, they should have the same rights as heterosexuals. You can't discriminate against people based on their sexual orientation. You should have separation in church and state anyhow. And so ultimately, they should have equal protection, especially when you take into account what that means nowadays, which is access to health insurance and tax incentives and everything else that marriage has with it. If you're just living with someone and one person passes away, the other person's family could come in and say, I want the property, so forth and so on. If you're married, then it just goes to the spouse. So there are pragmatic reasons as to why you'd want that. Last thing I have on there is drug laws. Obviously, Nixon started the war on drugs. He was like two birds, one stone, right? He didn't like the hippies starting their movement. He didn't like all the civil rights stuff that was going on. And many of them were also experimenting. So he put very strict regulations in place on drugs and so forth. On the progressive side, they're much more open to medical marijuana, just getting rid of that prohibition on marijuana altogether, quite frankly. They certainly see it more as an addiction, something you would categorize as mental health, not as necessarily anything you'd incarcerate people for, but rather that you would seek treatment for it. And they would want to try to stop the for-profit prisons and so forth as well. And libertarians, I have to mention them. I mean, they do not believe in drug laws. I think they're all unconstitutional. So this is a starting point to kind of give you a feel for how the different parties would feel about some of the key issues that are out there. And you probably already have figured much of that out by this point as you read through the articles and so forth, that the way you approach an issue is going to affect how you argue an issue. So thank you for listening.